we're going live,
Sure.
and hopefully it'll be all right. Yes, we are live, so I'm very glad to welcome you, Tom Sunic, to my channel to discuss a range of issues from monotheism, religion, anti-Semitism, and racism. I've been this afternoon reading up about the Congress of Berlin, which was something you mentioned in your interview with Piers Mellor in 2020, I believe. I wonder if you remember that interview.
A bit, yes.
Be all right. And it seems to me, from what I could glean, that there was a problem with um, how shall I put it? The Ottoman Empire was declining, and it was only to be expected that um, its regions that was strengthening as it was weakening would rebel against Ottoman rule. Um, and my amateur reading of history is that um, the Serbs did rather better under Ottoman rule than under the rule of the Austrian Empire. Or is that too simplistic a way of looking at things?
Well, as far as I can recall, this is an entirely different bend of our interview with this gentleman I had a couple of years back. When was it? In 2020? 2020. I guess we focused on some issues that were related, as far as I can recollect, to the ex-Yugoslavia, and I guess to some extent also to the Ottoman Empire. But I think I just want to make sure. I guess this interview of ours, this talk today with you, I guess it's mostly the way I see it. It's going to be focused on monotheism and polytheism and some issues like racism and anti-Semitism. But again, I'm your guest, so feel free to ask me any question, even if it's a provocative question. I'd be more than happy to accommodate you. Now, back to your question, as far as the Ottoman Empire is concerned, I guess, well, all in Central and Eastern Europe, this was the major power play, so to speak, from the 16th century all the way to the 19th century, to the Berlin Congress in 1978. Turkey, or for that matter, the Ottoman Empire, had played a very prominent role, not just in terms of power politics, but also in terms of foisting its religion, it's Islam, for that matter. Now, keep in mind, just 20 miles from where I live, there's Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is, by its majority, it's Muslim. Now, these are very secular Muslims, so don't confuse them with Saudi Arabians, for that matter, or Iraqis, or for that matter, Shiites in Persia or in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what can I tell you? I guess the way I see it, geography is our destiny, and sometimes you don't choose your political, for that matter, religious beliefs. Sometimes those beliefs are foisted upon you, whether you like it or not. Had I been born, had my parents been born, let's say 100 miles more to the south, more to the east, I would have probably ended up as a Christian Orthodox guy, or probably as a Muslim guy. Probably I would, instead of having a Thomas Sunic.
Does that make you Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah, Eastern Orthodox, because Serbs are mostly Eastern Orthodox. So are the Romanians in the Eastern Balkans, and Croatia fits into what we call, officially Western Balkans, along with the Slovenia, which is next door, about 5 miles from where I live. There's the border. I don't know if you can get an idea how actually claustrophobic this whole area is. The Balkans, or for that matter, Central and Eastern Europe. It's very densely populated. Well, not so much densely populated. It's rather small, in comparison, let's say, to France or Germany. What can I tell you? You take a bicycle, you drive for 50, 60 miles, you're already under different jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, now we have this European Union, so it's a different ballgame. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a troubling spot. It's right next door It's not a member of the European Union. It's majority Muslim, as I said, very secular, but yet at the same time there is this renaissance, there is this uh, drive towards more revival of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, keep in mind that Bosnia and Herzegovina, from the 15th century all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, was the jewel in the Ottoman crown. And many Turks, even nowadays, secular Turks in the government, in diplomacy, look very blonde, very European, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
Very proud to point to their Islamic, to their Bosnian heritage. Again, keep in mind, these are very secular Muslims. They're not just like Muslims in Saudi Arabia or some parts of the Maghreb.
Yes, could I just mention that I was reading about this history yesterday and today, and it seems that the Ottoman Empire invested much more in the Balkans than in Anatolia itself. But I don't know how true you think it is, but apparently that's what they did. They invested more in the infrastructure of the Balkans than they did in Anatolia, for example. That was what I read anyway.
Well, they're the Muslims, or rather, they can put it the Turks at that time. Again, this was a very generic term, the Turks, because they comprised tribes who were Islamized or who adopted their culture, their civilizations from all the way from the Crimea, the Ukraine, Hungary. Budapest was until 1689 was also a crown in the Ottoman Empire. It was 150 years under the Ottoman rule. Now, of course, the Ottomans back then, especially in the 17th, 18th century, they were good for making bridges. So even when we talk about the architecture, bridge building, they were known for bridges. Even if you're familiar with this guy, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He was of Serbian, Croatian, Croats. Serbs the quarrel whether he was Serb or Croat. Ivan Andrić was a Nobel Prize winner, and he was awarded with the Nobel Prize for his book, for his novel, The Bridge Over the River Drina. Drina is the river separating Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina further to the east, if you look at the map. So I always feel comfortable when I lecture my students. I always like having a map in front of myself so I can walk through and I can guide them through and so on. So yes, they were good, but in terms of some more sophisticated architecture, well, I guess I certainly wouldn't like to hurt anybody's feelings. These were mostly the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarians, because Hungary and Austria, they had the rule over this area, including Bosnia and Herzegovina after the Berlin Congress, until the First World War. So even now, the architecture in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, all what you see downtown are the buildings of secessionist style, of neo-Baroque style. Of course, you see quite a few mosques, no question about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's it has a very special flavor, the Sarajevo city, and it was largely built, heavily invested by the Austrian authorities until the end of the First World War. After the First World War, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart. The Ottoman Empire fell apart further to the east, and most of those new countries, merged into one new entity known as Yugoslavia. And you know how it all ended. It was another construct, probably well meant, well designed, but unfortunately, I don't believe very much in constructs and in wishful thinking. It just had tragic results for all of us.
Well, I suppose empires are constructs, as are nations, because it's an
sure,
abstract idea.
By all means, and I fully agree with you. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to be very laudatory about the English experience either. Quite to the contrary, as a Central European person, very similar to German fellow colleagues of mine, and even to some colleagues of mine in France, I've never been very ecstatic about the English, for that matter, British imperial drives be it in New Zealand or be it in Canada or be it elsewhere, and the way how they treated the indigenous people, and for that matter, how they treated the European people. Even nowadays, there's a certain. I'll just make a detour here. Even nowadays, Croats have a certain beef, if I can put it that way, against the English, especially against the British, because of we're part and parcel of the first the Holy Roman Empire, and then I was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then of course during the Second World War we fought. Croatia fought on the side of the Germans. It was the last ally. So yes, there is still a certain beef against the English, against the British for their balance of power politics, and they're playing sort of a double game against different factors, different what do you call it, actors in the Balkans. So, let alone that, of course, the Croatian popular consciousness. I'm not necessarily sharing that, but Croats, particularly after the Second World War and the war ended, the English troops, the British troops, the occupying troops, they were in charge of Carinthia, it was southern Austria, which is about 150 miles from where I live, right on the southern border of Austria and Slovenia, northern border of Slovenia. There are hundreds of thousands of Croats and Ukrainians, of course, the Cossacks and Serbs and many, many East Europeans who just, for a variety of reasons, had ended up on a different side of the barricades. They had collaborators with the German National Socialist regime, and they were handed over to the communists by the British troops, by Mr. Churchill. So, of course, in our popular consciousness, just like the Iraqis probably, or like some, what do you call it, Iraqis, or probably even Palestinians, and regardless, irrespective of who you talk to, there's a certain animosity towards the history writing. Now, of course, the persons who are always welcome, and I guess this is just a cliche, a buzzword. Croats are very enamored with Germany and with the German culture. Well, of course, they don't like the present German government and so on, but that's a different ballgame.
Do Serbs ever compare them, the different empires that they've been under, saying, which is the worst so far and which is the least bad of all? I mean, do they have a view about these things?
I'm sorry. Did you ask me about? Excuse me, about the Serbs or the Croats specifically?
You consider yourself a Croat or Serb? I'm sorry.
Yes, I was born a Christian, and I have I was raised in a family, very Catholic, very Croat, with this very pronounced national consciousness. And my old man, my dad, he was not a chauvinist, far from it. He had some good relationship with his colleagues in Serbia. For that matter, even in Albanians, he knew some intellectuals. He was a lawyer for some time. He ended twice in prison in communist Yugoslavia, anyway. So he was an anti-communist, but he was not a rabbi nationalist. Probably I am one, but he was certainly a very moderate person and very modest in that sense. And yes, we had a strong sense of nationhood and rootedness in our culture, in Croatian culture, in our Catholicism. And
so is a Croat a Serb? I don't know. I see the word Serbo-Croat put together.
Yes.
I'm not even sure whether you are the same thing or you're not, or whether you'll get cross with me for confusing the two. But Serbia is. You consider yourself a Slav, wouldn't you? I suppose with ethnic.
No, I consider myself a Croat, but I don't want to use now this platform to demonize the Serbs, so for that, and make some blasphematory or some derogatory statements against them, like many of my colleagues in Croatia do. That's the bad thing. That's the bad side of nationalism, any nationalism for that matter. And despite the fact that I'm often portrayed by some left-leaning circles and some agencies as a whatever, nationalist or white nationalist, whatever that means, I'm very, very skeptical about nationalism in Europe, because be it as it may, we may now be critical against aliens, against Jews, if you wish, against this and that, against capitalism, against communism. But the fact of the matter is that this widespread, I call it negative legitimacy, negative identity nationalism, is very much widespread all over Europe. Let me give you an example. Croats, for instance, base very often, I'm talking specifically about Croatian nationalists, they often build up their national consciousness on the rejection and the vilification or demonization of the Serb nationalists, and vice versa. Hungarians, for instance, they also have some bizarre and often, well, bizarre, good people as well, but often they wallow in this, they double down on those imperial pretensions. They think that they should probably recuperate some parts of Romania, which historically may have or may have not belonged to Hungarian population. You have the same thing, of course. This is the golden example, not a good one, of Poles and the Germans. They're still Croatian. I'm sorry, German nationalists, and I know quite a few of them, and Polish nationalists, and I respect them both. But they still, have those quarrels, those mythological stories, or narrative is a popular word, about whether they're part of Danzig or whether Gdansk or whether part of the Pomerania or Pomerania should be recuperated by Germany, which was part of Germany once upon a time. So again, briefly put, I reject this modern brand of nationalism. I think it's very harmful to all of us. And again, it serves not the cause of Europeans, it serves the cause of non-Europeans.
Don't you think that America, as a global empire, has an interest in discouraging nationalism? Because any sense of national self-consciousness would make any country under its imperium say, no, we're not going to keep doing what you tell us to do anymore, Uncle Sam. We're going to do things our way. And unfortunately for Western Europe, I don't even think Europeans know that they are an occupied country. The entire all of Europe is an occupied country, occupied by America, but they don't know that that's what it is. I mean, that's why European leaders are so terrified of acting in the national interest. I mean, they're just so accustomed to following orders from Washington or the EU that if you set them adrift, they just wouldn't know what to do. And that's why they don't want it. They want to continue receiving orders from Washington and carrying them out. And that's how they roll, because that's all they know.
This is a huge topic, Claire. Listen, we can point out a paradox here, a very, very glaring one. On the one hand, nationalism, white nationalism specifically, is discouraged and even, to some extent, even penalized in the United States of America. White nationalism, white extremism, whatever they call it. On the other hand, you see the prison government of Joe Biden, which is promoting Ukrainian nationalism, which is even financing, I don't know, I don't have empirical evidence for it, except for the fact that there are quite a few of Croats fighting on the Ukrainian side, hardcore nationalists in the Azov regime. Mm-hmm. So again, that's the paradox that, again, if you can follow me on that, the American official policy towards Ukraine does not object nationalism and the rise,
as long as it hurts Russia,
rebirth of nationalism. Yes, again, but then on the other hand, they object nationalism on their own turf, including nationalism in Germany and Croatia and so on. Of course, now again, whatever we may say about America, it just follows to a large extent, the former imperial policy of England. It just divides and rules. It can sometimes sponsor and endorse nationalism. For instance, certain groups in the Balkans, like for instance, they have a large military base in Kosovo. They're Americans, and now they're all behind the quote-unquote Albanian nationalism. they're quite critical of Serbian nationalism, though. So they're also so critical of Russian nationalism. So they just follow their imperial rules. And I guess if I was in their shoes, I would probably do the same thing, just like the old Romans did. So we can make no value judgment, say this is good or bad, and I fully agree with you. We don't want to say occupying power because this doesn't sound very politically correct. But the fact of the matter is, the European Union, all those supranational institutions like World Monetary Fund, and then even the United Nations and international tribunals, all they were crafted, they were originated in the United States of America after the Second World War. So America won the war, the Second World War, along with the Soviets. And of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they became so to speak, the major hegemon in the world arena. And I guess that's the way it is. It has always been like that.
Yes, the
And we
British
can now be very
Empire.
critical of it.
Because it seems to be
The
the
British
nature of
Empire,
empire to move goods and services and people around in its global empire. So the British were known for upsetting the racial balances of different countries, such as Malaysia, it moved people around at will. The slave trade, all kinds of things. So once we understand how who's in charge and what they do to us, it certainly makes sense why we are not allowed in our different countries to act in our national interest, because America forbids it and calls it a bad kind of nationalism. They'll call people who object to immigration racists or Nazis or fascists, etc. And I suppose this would continue forever if the American people were themselves happy with it, but it seems they're not. They're not happy with the same treatment that is being meted out to themselves when they complain about immigration, and it seems to me is the cause of the problem. And onto the subject of nationalism. I think nations need some kind of moral system to define themselves against the other. And I wasn't aware of this until you mentioned that Bosnia-Herzegovina was mostly Muslim, and you're saying, and then I remembered that it was a non-NATO country. It, of all the little countries of Europe, is firmly saying no to America, and I think it may be something to do with them being Muslim and saying, oh, we're not like you Christians, we're not going to come under the umbrella of NATO. Do you think that might be something to do with it?
You mean specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Is that your question?
Yes, but because it's not NATO yet, is it? Bosnia-Herzegovina.
No, it's not a member of NATO. It's not the part of the European Union. It's struggling, of course. It's a hot spot in a way. It's not very well defined as an entity. Now, keep in mind that Bosnia and Herzegovina is right in the middle of what was once Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
And even the war, the recent war, 30 years, well, it was not that recent, but 25 years back, actually had its momentum, had its, what's the best word in English, had its ugliest part in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, the composition of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's about 4 million people live there. It's the size of Croatia approximately. It doesn't have exit to the sea, the coast. Well, it does have a little chunk of just a couple of miles, that's it, but it's not enough for them. It doesn't have a solid government. The reason being is that you have 3 different constituent peoples. You have majority Bosnian Muslims. Now, of course, they're Muslims. They call themselves Muslims, Bosnian. And now, of course, they have crafted a new name from themselves, Bosnians. Now, once upon a time, they were good Turks. They defined themselves as Turks, then at some point as Austrians. Then during the Second World War, there were quite a few of Bosnian Muslims who collaborated and who were full-fledged Croats. Now, keep in mind that even the fascist Croatia during the Second World War, the pseudo-fascist Croatia, which was a firm ally of National Socialist Germany, despite being very Catholic, a very, very strong Catholic, had 4 ministers of Muslim origin and of Muslim background. In fact, there was a big mosque was built by the Germans and by the Croats right in the center of the city where I live here.
Mm-hmm.
So you always have to look at things from a different perspective, not just from one. Now, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the second largest group are the ethnic Serbs. Of course, they look up to Belgrade. They have their identity. They can always identify themselves with Belgrade. And of course, they make no secret about that. They would like to fuse with Serbia proper into a larger Serbia. And of course, it may look a little bit bizarre because this corridor that links the Serbs in the western part of Bosnia and Herzegovina is very narrow. And I guess, I don't know how physically and how logistically this would be a good bridge. But nonetheless, they have, okay, let me just clarify. Both Serbs and Croats make a minority. There are only 300,000 of them living in Herzegovina, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the southern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Both Serbs and Croats have their alma mater. They can all identify themselves with their respective neighboring states, be
Mm-hmm.
Serbia, Belgrade, and Zagreb, Croatia. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
there are many, many Croats. In fact, most Croats that I know of from Bosnia and Herzegovina have dual citizenship. Most Serbs that I know of from Bosnia and Herzegovina have also dual citizenship, the citizenship of Serbia and the citizenship of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, of course, those who are in the lurch to some extent, the majority, 2.5 million Bosnian Muslims. As I said, they're Muslims, but they're very, very secular. Please keep that in mind. Very, probably even more secular than the Turks. Very secular.
Mm-hmm.
They drink alcohol, they smoke dope, whatever you like. They look just like you and me, whatever. You know. So they just have names like Mohammed or Aliyah and so on. Most of them, of course, they're radical parts of that, but that's a different ballgame. And what I'm trying to say is that they look up to Turkey, whether they don't speak the Turkish language, but they need a sense of inspiration. They need a sort of psychological endorsement, despite the fact that Sarajevo to Istanbul, it's about 800 miles. 800 miles. But they do feel a little proclivity of identifying themselves with Turkey because they don't have identifying power in the vicinity that can look after them, like Serbs and Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, there is still a great deal of tension going on. Of course, this is all now very calm, very peaceful, very quiet. But you can never rule out anything here in the Balkans. Well, for that matter, you can never rule out anything in Europe. On the average, if you look from Cromwell, shall we start with the English Revolution, 16th, 17th century, all the way until 21st century, on the average, we had every 40 years, we had major disasters, major wars here in Europe. You had the English Revolution, and you had the 30 Years' War in Europe, which cost us millions and millions of dead, the 7 Years' War, and the First World War. The Second World War was a disaster, and then it would be foolish, and I'm a cultural pessimist, it would be foolish to assume that history will come to an end with some multicultural hug, if we all start virtue signaling and saying, oh, we all love each other. It's far from it. That's not a human nature. So anyway, I'm quite pessimistic.
But don't you see that Christianity has not been good for Serbs and Europeans? Could that be said as a historian?
Yes. This is a theological issue that you're raising, and I would certainly be very pleased to answer that. In fact, I would suggest to some of your readers to read some of my, well, first they can start with Nietzsche, of course, who influenced me very much, in his book Antichrist. But there are lots of others, not just Germans, but also French.
He was the one who pronounced the death of God, Nietzsche.
Yes, the death of God. But I guess with all due modesty, but I don't want to play too much with modesty. I would certainly encourage you to read some of my scholarly pieces on monotheism and polytheism. The one was published in Clio,
Hmm.
Monotheism and Polytheism.
Which do you
That's a long
favor?
time ago. Pardon?
Which do you
In
favor?
1990. What do I think of?
Which do you favor?
I'm
You said your book, Polytheism and Monotheism. Did you?
Okay, now this was the large piece, a scholarly piece, Monotheism and Polytheism, that I published in the Clio academic journal in the States in 1994. And it's also posted on my website. So have a look at it. And
I will.
it's heavily footnoted that it's very scholarly, very dry. And again, but it's basically my major argument is that all our predicaments, all our religious wars, and of course the secular modalities in communism and liberalism can be traced back to Judaism and Christianity especially. So I would,
But could
I'm
be
not going
resolved
to
by
now
Islam? Do you not think that, are there not signs in Bosnia Herzegovina that Bosnia Herzegovina have this sense of nationhood to reject NATO membership? It's only a little country, but it's held out. Maybe that's something to note.
Well, as far as, again, we have just changed the topic, if I'm following you correctly, Claire. Bosnia and Herzegovina would certainly like to join the NATO and the European Union. They're all, they're eager about that.
Oh, they
But
want
as
to
I said at the
join.
beginning,
Oh,
they would love to. But the fact is that I forgot to mention that, given the fact that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a highly polarized country along those ethnic lines, despite the fact there's no major war going on, but it's very, very polarized along those ethnic lines. People don't segregate officially, but they self-segregate very, very much.
mm-hmm.
I can tell you that. So at this stage, I don't think they will meet the requirements of NATO and, for that matter, European Union. But I would certainly, I'm just taking a wild guess, but from what I know from some of my contacts, there are quite a few of what I call special advisors, call them whatever, whichever guys they may use from America, European Union, and so on, who are quite active in Sarajevo and Bosnia and Herzegovina and different areas of and who are basically, although Russians are quite strong over there, and they have good relationship with the Bosnia Republic. It's a semi-enclave. It's a semi-independent state within the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Majority of Serbs live there, and they're quite strong. They have their own army, so it's almost like a state within a state. And of course, they have a good relationship with Russia, and of course with the present regime. So keep in mind, this is in case of a major, who knows, conflagration in Europe. I'm sure that the Russians would not hesitate to play their card in the Serbian card against the Croatian or Muslim or Bosnian card in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So lots of activities is going on over there, very much undercover. But as I said, the things that sometimes erupt all of a sudden without us even knowing about this.
Yes, no one
And again,
expects
keep in
a
mind, this is a
revolution.
very small area. This is a very small area. If you have a good bike, you can basically cross. Well, it might probably take you a day or so to cross with a bicycle, a small bike, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's a small area, about 30,000 square miles, less than that.
And Russia would regard it as an act of treachery, would it
Absolutely,
not,
absolutely.
if
And
they
of course,
became NATO?
yes, of course, Russia has a decent relationship, very good. Well, keep in mind that the neighboring Serbia has disavowed the what do you call it? Sanctions, European Union sanctions against Russia. It's the only European country. Serbia also is not a member of the European Union. It's not a member of NATO, but it has warm ties with Russia and with the present government for a variety of reasons, both historical, of course, they're Christian Orthodox, they're they have historical ties, and of
Mhm,
course they want to,
mhm,
like they want to hedge themselves against quote unquote American. That's what they say, against American imperial ambitions. On the other hand, the Muslim Albanians in the Kosovo area in Albania proper, they are part and parcel of the NATO, not yet of European Union. A very strong American presence there, also military presence. As I said, everything is honky dory now. Everything is fine. People go and enjoy the alcohol, the joints, whatever. Just the place looks very nice.
mhm,
And if you visit this area, it's really beautiful looking. It's good,
mhm.
but you never know how things may play out in the future. So
Yes.
again, keep in mind Serbia is a very prominent factor here in the Balkans, unlike Romania, which is also part and parcel of the NATO and European Union, unlike Bulgaria, which is also a member, NATO member and European Union member, unlike Hungary, which is both, unlike Croatia, which is also both, let's call it Americanosphere.
Mhm,
Serbia sticks out as a non-European, non-EU country, non-NATO member. They have good relationship with the United States. They have diplomatic ties, but they are not too warm
mhm,
about uh, American engagement
mhm.
in
Yes.
Ukraine and for that and
Yes.
and
Yes.
supply of weapons and so on.
Mhm. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to divert from the subject of your book, polytheism and monotheism, and you were saying that
Yes.
it's basically about the problem of religion. Um, do you, are you
Mhm.
sort of saying we would be better off under polytheism, or I don't know. I'm just guessing at what the book your book might say.
No, that's a very good point that you're raising. In fact, Larry, let me tell you, we have to dispel this idea that polytheists, so let's call them pagans. Okay, polytheism is a different word for pagan. But this paganism has a bad connotation, very derogatory. It means like somebody who is half-wit and who is a little bit crazy, who believes in demons and so on. This is to a large extent due to the Catholic propaganda, Christian propaganda over the last 2,000 years. So that's the reason I prefer the word, polytheism. Of course, you have different denominations, like you have Druid denominations in England and in Norway as well. You have Asatru, and some of my colleagues are members of the Asatru movement in the United States of America. The way I look at this polytheism, please let's dispel this idea of folks just walking around with some torches lit, and of course you have weirdos everywhere,
Mhm,
those polytheists, like New Age type of escapades, and I'm not into that. For me, polytheism means a sense of tolerance. And let me just back up. I guess I'd like to make a strong statement here. In fact, it was mentioned by great authors, Nietzsche, Meinecke, different authors, Mencken as well. Meinecke was a German scholar. And of course, Quincy, well, who else, were pagans, pagan authors. Quincy was English author. I read much when I was a kid. Aldous Huxley, as Aldous Huxley, the great author I grew up with, his books I grew up with. And anyway, polytheism means the polytheistic, it means having an idea of the world which does not exclude the other,
mhm,
be he a Jew, be he a Muslim, be he whatever, he a Martian, a cat worshiper, a dog worshiper, whatever. And this is something we have to give full credit to the old Romans. And even if you read some English scholars, Toynbee, and if you read, what was the guy's name? It will come to mind. It will come to my mind. No, it will come to my mind. I often quote him in this piece of mine. The old Romans, they never fought religious wars. They never fought ideological wars. And in fact, they often adopted deities and religious truths of different tribes that they conquered. Of course, they waged brutal wars with each other. They had social wars, civil wars in the first century, if you recall well, and even prior to the first century, during Sulla and Marius and so on. And of course, the third century was very, very bad, but they never persecuted the Christians because of their Christian beliefs. They persecuted them for rejecting the imperial cult. They persecuted them because rejecting the Roman law, but they were extremely tolerant. And I certainly sometimes regret for not living in the ancient Roman Empire.
Mm.
Let me just transpose it a little bit on the secular level. Because what are basically modern ideologies? Modern ideologies are what? Secular religions. What was once Christianity, Islam, and Judaism turned now into what we have is liberalism and communism. Once Christians preached equality in the heavens, and now they preach equality on the ground, on earth. So I've written extensively about this, and I certainly wouldn't like to bombard you with too many ideas and too many facts at this stage. But let me just recap once again. Polytheism presupposes a certain different levels of thinking, different levels of adopting objective reality. It certainly doesn't mean exclusion. And this is something we have to look at, especially when we read some ancient scholars who are quote unquote pagan authors. Why do we now? We don't have to harp now on the Bible so much. Why don't we read Cicero, Seneca, or for that matter, Homer? I feel much more at home reading Homer than reading the Bible. Bible is strange to me, and so is, well, with all due respect for the Islam and so on, but I just don't very much identify with this type of a monotheistic belief. And to be quite blunt with you, regardless of what your personal beliefs are, as a caveat, I was raised in a Catholic family, by the way. I have a couple of uncles who are also Jesuits and so on. But regardless of it, they're very critical towards monotheism and Christianity. If you look at the whole history of Christianity, with all due respect, we know very well what Christian churches in Russia, and Ukraine, and Croatia, and Hungary went through during the Cold War. We know very well the killing fields by communists and so on. But the fact is, I have to admit it, the Catholic Church has not been very kind to non-believers, even prior to becoming an official religion in the 5th century during Theodosius and during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius and Honorius. It had been engaged in a heavy ethnic cleansing of different sects, let alone what we have from the 6th century all the way to what happened in England during Cromwell, what he did with the Catholics, let alone what the Christian wars fighting was a massacres. We're talking about major cataclysms. So I'm not happy with the track record of Christianity. Of course, with all due respect now for Vatican, and he's preaching about, he's kissing the feet of Africans and Asians, whatever he likes. He talks about ecumenism and how we have to love our neighbors and so on. But the legacy of the Catholic Church or the Protestants, it's just horrendous. Now, again, I don't want to spare the Muslims, like many of my colleagues, nationalists. I certainly respect them, but there are certain things which I thoroughly disagree. Why, for instance, now demonize the Muslims? Of course, I know that there are quite a few of them in the UK, in France, there's about 7 million of them. In the UK, about 4 million, and of course, in the Balkans, we have, as I said, these are indigenous Muslims. So don't mix them up. Don't mix them with migrants. These are Slavs, whites who accepted or adopted, Islam in the 16th century willingly. They were not forced upon. So basically, what I'm saying is that also Islam wasn't very kind to non-Islamic believers. Look at what's going on with the Turks. The Turks didn't preach here brotherhood and unity, and they were not virtue signaling about justice and tolerance. They were coming here all the way to Carinthia. Carinthia is an area in southern Slovenia. They made it to Venice almost. They made it, yes, there's even a movie on that. They made the Turks, when they crossed the Balkans, they came to Carinthia. And Trieste, they actually observed Trieste from the mountains, and they went to Carinthia, to Salzburg. Not Salzburg is further north; they didn't reach there, but they came to Vienna in 1683. They came to Vienna, into the heart the apple of Europe, to the heart of Europe, Christian Europe.
Yes.
And of course, they did it because they were deeply persuaded they were good at God's work. There are probably good people among them. We're pretty much sure they were. But they thought that they were doing that for their monotheistic because they thought that they had the key to the truth.
Yes.
And of course, they had the Judaism. It's a different ballgame. We don't want to spare them either. I should just read the Deuteronomy. Read, please. Read. Have your readers, have your listeners read the Deuteronomy. Have them read the St. John's Apocalypse, but especially the old Torah, the Torah, parts and parcels of it, which is a blueprint for ethnic cleansing, for a blueprint for killing fields.
But I suppose wars are about.
Pardon? Excuse me?
Wars are. These wars are really political wars. I suppose, in modern warfare, the ideological reason would be, well, my political system is better than your political system. And I suppose that applies to my religion is better than your religion. And I was thinking that Eastern Europeans, particularly in the Balkans, they would actually have a kind of record of how things were when they were under the Ottoman Empire and when they were under the Austrian Empire. And I was thinking that Christianity has kind of failed Europeans because it keeps having all these wars and clearly white people don't feel particularly protected by Christianity, either in America or the rest of the West.
Well, I guess certainly I have respect for your beliefs, and I assume you're a Muslim, right?
I'm not actually.
I'm
an agnostic. I suppose I kind of give Muslim
good
signals, but I have considered the matter at some detail. I like to think I've looked at all the different religions and the history behind it. You were talking about the Romans and the polytheism that they tolerated, but ultimately the Romans themselves Christianized. So we have to deduce from that the fact that their polytheism failed. That's why they Christianized.
Well, again, you just popped up in the name of Gibbon. I'm sure you're familiar.
Yes, he blamed
Gibbon,
the fall of the Roman Empire on Christianity, didn't he?
Yes. He was very much. I share his thoughts fully, and he actually mentions in some paragraphs, in some passages. I don't know where exactly. I do quote him quite often about Christianity being a prime factor in the dissolution of the Roman Empire. The early Christians, they just simply refused the draft. They refused serving the Roman religions, religious rites and prescriptions. And again, that's what he says. That's what he argues. And many other authors, I think Spengler at some points as well, and Toynbee. I'm quoting quite a few. I can't now keep track of all those names that I'm using in my pieces, who actually specifically argue that paganism was disappeared. And in fact, the Roman Empire as a political entity, as a legal entity, a huge entity stretching from Scotland, where it is now Aberdeen, all the way down to Basra. This was what the Roman Empire was all about. So we are talking about an unprecedented civilization, which had its rules, regulations, it had its criminal code, which had its constitution, and of course, I certainly admire this part of my legacy, and I certainly feel sorry that it just was so much disrupted. Again, who actually who actually started this? It's hard for me to say. There is probably something easygoing and something acceptable, and what's the better word? Palatable. Yes, palatable for the masses. Just like communism is palatable. I was shocked when I was a boy here in communist Yugoslavia, where I grew up. Just couldn't fathom and couldn't even grasp this idea that many intelligent people in the UK, especially college people and academics, could accept it, could endorse the Marxist mistake. For me, this is bizarre. It was completely weird. Adopting this idea of the end of history, a classless society, of this utopian society. This is a palaver. This was an idiocy, the way I saw it, even before I started reading serious books. And again, the same thing can be said about Christianity. They had a certain appealing nature for the masses of slaves, of women, especially there were quite a few women who were Christians.
Hmm.
Even Nero's wife, or
People
his wife,
expected to,
it will come to my mind.
yes, people expected
Yes, and
to
of course,
accept their fate.
Christianity was something. It preached love, love. And I myself, given my rebellious nature, I'm always a little bit suspicious of somebody who talks about love and tolerance, because it's very often it's a guise for the opposite. And of course, this was the Christianity, and what happened then. And of course, on the secular level, we have Marxism now, communism, liberalism, which is basically preaching the same story, like virtue signaling and cancel culture, multiculturalism. Here's another offshoot of communism. I cannot now go into linguistics or other semantic distortions, but basically what you have in the UK, or for that matter, even in the European Union, with all due respect, don't get me wrong, but knowing very well what happened in multicultural Yugoslavia, multiracial Yugoslavia, I have no, how do you say it? No illusions about the collapse. I don't want to say it's a strong word, collapse, but dysfunction in the English society in the years to come. Because you simply cannot put things together. You could not put Serbs, Croats, Muslims together. Everybody had his own mythology. Everybody had his own narrative. Everybody had his own victimhood and victimology. And again, it just was bound to explode. So sooner or later, how is this going to explode in the European Union? When and where? Who is going to be the main factor? I have no idea. Having said that, let me again, this is not a disclaimer. I don't have much, illusions about quote unquote ethno state that some of my colleagues often like to fantasize about, which is good. I respect it. But look, when whites run out of Jews or Arabs or Muslims, they start whacking each other. I know it firsthand. So I'm sorry to
Exactly.
say that I probably.
Yes. So
And
that's
I
why
guess
I see the
look what happened in
importance
the
of
Balkans.
religion to regulate the
Well,
behavior of people. Because, white nationalists, they think race can be their religion, but actually, if you ask them more detailed questions, they'll say, well, obviously we don't include liberals and the people who invite all the immigrants in, and then they have a list of white people that they want to whack already. So it doesn't make sense even on their own terms. And obviously, I'm saying Christianity failed white people even when Europe was monoracial and a continent of monarchs. And obviously, the people must have hated Christianity because they were burnt at the stake for, denying the Trinity. This was a known Christian practice of dealing with heretics. That was the Christian cancel culture. Burning heretics
yes.
at the stake, and it seems to me that when Europeans crossed the Atlantic and went to America, they thought, we're not going to have this anymore. We're not going to have a king, and we're not going to have Christianity, which supports the divine right of the king. We're going to have a republic. We're not going to have an official religion. So said the founding fathers. But I think after 250 years, we are seeing the consequence of Congress not having a rule-based system for them to adhere to, because all these amendments, in fact 27 amendments so far, have all
Yes.
been about trying to get round the Constitution. And I'm saying
Well, you don't have to
maybe
go
they
that
should have
far. You can
a
start with
religion,
it.
and then they would be
Yes.
able to contain all
I
the
follow you. I
simmering
agree with you. I
differences.
fully agree with you. Claire, I agree with you. And I guess, as I said, although I'm ranked and I'm categorized as a quote unquote white nationalist, whatever that means, and I certainly respect, folks of my tribe and of my in group, if I can put it more eloquently.
Hmm.
And I certainly like traveling to the States and going there and giving lectures. But I have some very grave, uh, how can I say, second thoughts about this quote unquote majestic white ethno states, because knowing the Europeans how they are, again, we don't have to go that far. I was going to mention a while ago the American Civil War, or rather the War of Secession, was the first major total war. Was not conducted against the Indians, or for that matter, against the Arabs or the Japanese or for the Germans. It was the war between whites and among whites. 500,000 people perished. So
Yes.
again, I don't have. Well, I know sometimes it hurts the illusions of some of my colleagues, but I just want to be straightforward because there is an ample literature on that, and I guess we have to face the future as it is and face the reality as it is, not as I would like to see it. Having said that, of course I'm critical of capitalism. Of course I'm critical of some excessive percentage of Jews in the government, in State Department, in other parts of America, and so on, and not just in America, but also in France and in the UK. But again, it has to do also with Christianity, and this is where I have to say, that's the final word. This is where I have to reject this anti-Semitism, because very often anti-Semitism is a part of neurosis. Probably the word schizophrenia would be better. I know quite a few of quote unquote, and I respect some of them very, very much, including some of your guests who made critical comments about Jews and so on. That's fine. But at the other hand, even my mom, my late mom, and my grandparents, whatever, they're all ardent Christians, ardent Catholics. Yet at the same time, they didn't like the Jews. And then I would ask them, well, why do you hate the Jews? And yet at the same time, accept Jesus Christ and his apostles, they were all Jews, 100%. And even, you're all Verus Israel. There's a nice book by a Jewish scholar, Verus Israel, on the true Israel. So that's the problem with the Christians, especially Bible thumpers in the United States of America. They often like to pontificate about the chosen country and so on. They don't like the Jews, particularly in the Bible Belt, but yet at the same time, they fully, practice the Jewish, how can I say, the canons and its rights and so
Well,
on.
they culturally
Claire,
appropriated. Sorry.
Claire, I guess we can go on for a couple of more minutes and then we'll have to wind down.
Okay.
And if at some point you can organize something, there will be certainly a place to be at your service. And why not? At some point, you can take this veil off and we can get together and talk a little bit face to face.
Okay. Well, you can see pictures of me, and but yes, I wanted to say, but before we finish this conversation, this thing about Judaism, which is that really Gentiles have culturally appropriated their God and their scripture. And that might explain why
Yes,
everything is Jewish. I mean, if you steal somebody's clothes, then you might kind of look like them and be mistaken for them and be a little confused about
absolutely. I
your
fully
your
agree
own
with you.
identity. And this, I don't think, is something I think Westerners understand about their history because they're not told this,
Mm,
that Christianity was not always liberal. Christians were not always meek and mild. They were, we know from the wars of the Reformation, very cruel to each other. They fought terrible wars. They started 2 world wars. If there's a third world war, it will be started again by people identifying themselves as Christian, I'm sure. So um, I'm saying there is an obvious religion that they could be considering if they really need a religion. And I guess my other point is that you might be considered a white supremacist if you think white people don't need a religion, because everybody else, kind of, buckles down to the idea of we must have a religion. We don't have a religion for fun, but it's something to do with making us marry before we have children, and that is the least that all religions do. And it seems to me
yeah,
Christianity is the weakest link because it was just thrown out in the last 50 years
yes,
because of feminism. So I think the disbelief in Christianity has existed since since the founding fathers, because they were the ones who first rejected Christianity, because they saw they had to reject Christianity as a religion that supported the divine right to rule. And we are just
You're right.
the
Yes, God.
living through the
We now take it
consequences.
for granted. Yes, I agree with you. And as I said, I guess this is just a side note. I certainly would be pleased to meet you in person. If you organize something, let me know, and we can have. The way I see it, I mean, I don't know. I know very little about your background, but you articulate very well. You appear like a very nice woman, like a very nice lady, and I certainly wouldn't mind being of service, further service, except that I get tired after an hour or so,
Okay,
and
I
I
understand.
certainly would.
Yes, and
No,
well,
no,
if you're
and I
ever in
certainly,
London, you made Zagreb sounds such a fascinating place with its wonderful bridges and even more wonderful Austrian architecture that I think I would
yeah,
like
well,
to visit.
yeah,
I did
well, by
go
all
to
means, you're more than welcome.
yes, I did visit. Oh, where's this place in Dalmatian sea by the sea? It's very beautiful,
Oh,
and the blueness of the sea.
yes,
Um, but I'll remember where it was. But the
sure.
pavement seemed to be made of marble. It was raining, and I remember
Ah,
it being very slippery. But perhaps you will it will come to you. But thank you so much, Tom Sunik, for
well, thank you, Claire. And as I said, I'm at your service. And if you have some interesting gentlemen, ladies, people, academics, or even normal workers, down to earth folks, and if I can be of any assistance, either with my books or either with some interviews, let alone some speeches, some talks, I'll be more than happy
perhaps you'll
to
come back
be
again.
of service.
Would you like to come back again?
I hope so indeed. Okay.
Oh, I'm
I hope
very
so indeed, Claire.
okay. Thank you
And
very much.
thank you very much, and let's keep in touch.
Yes. Thank you and goodbye.